I mean, to say that I'm worried about extremism is an understatement. It is wreaking havoc in the world, and I don't think that we're doing enough. It's gone out of fashion to call evil evil. We can't even use that word anymore, but I do, and I think that we need to. England is almost giving up on being England. You know, since October 7th, the protests that are happening weekly and the disrespect we've seen from these protests, forget about to the Jewish people, but to English society and culture and history and identity. And for it to kind of just go without much response, I worry about that, frankly.
So would you say in that respect then that the UK has failed? Is it something that can be fixed?
I'm an optimist at heart, but I will say to you, Jonathan, it's hard for me in this situation. I think what it will require is a firm owning and reclaiming of British identity. It will require some very uncomfortable things, and certainly things that in our current society would be deemed perhaps even politically incorrect to do. The whole point is covenant. It is God inviting us in, saying, listen, what do you say about my principles? How do you apply them into your life, into your situation? Let's work together on this. That is Jewish tradition. Well, there's no standards anymore in terms of who we call Hitler and what we call Nazi and what we term genocide.
I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. Rabbi J. Dweck, thanks very much for joining me today. How are you doing?
Pleasure. I'm all right. Thanks, Jonathan.
Good. We're enjoying a nice summer.
We certainly are. Yeah.
So the big news for you is after, I think, 11 years of being the senior rabbi of the oldest Jewish community in the United Kingdom, you're moving on to new pastures. So tell me first where you're going.
Yeah, well, it will be 12 actually, because I started in 2013, but I wasn't living here yet, you know, coming in and out. But my family and I are moving to Israel. We'll be living in Jerusalem, hopefully. Yeah.
Interesting time to be making that move.
It is an interesting time. Yeah, it is an interesting time. I will say that, you know, we've always wanted to be there. You know, we always kind of planned to be there. But recently, being there has felt so much like home for us. And my kids, the majority of them are already living there. So Margalit and I kind of thought, you know, it's time.
So I thought this would be a good opportunity for us to discuss the time you've spent here and the observations that you've had as a result of that, because you've been a community rabbi for most of your career, and you've done that in the United States and also here in the UK.
Yeah.
So first off, what did you expect to find when you first came to London to lead this community, and how did it differ when you got here?
Well, I mean, I'll say I'm an Anglophile, you know, so I've always loved England, the UK, you know, for you know, much of my life. And when I received a phone call from the community, you know, a member of the community, asking if I'd be interested in kind of, you know, taking the role of senior rabbi, I was really interested in it. For me, part of it was that I like the idea of possibly living here, you know, and you know, being in the country, but I also wanted to have an opportunity to have a different experience, because, you know, in New York, I was serving the Syrian Jewish community for 15 years. And it's an amazing community, very close-knit community, very strong community. But I had reached a point in where I kind of was looking for something different, you know, maybe a bit broader, a bit more worldly. I wasn't actively looking, but, you know, when I received that call, I thought, you know, maybe this is something I'd like to do. And so arriving here, I can say that aspect of it was definitely here. You know, I mean, in our community, which you're a member of, and your family is longstanding members, it's invigorating because you have a community in which, you know, on any given Shabbat, Saturday, where I'm giving a sermon, in the audience, you will have physicians, you know, business people, culinary experts, psychologists, car designers, you know, the gamut of, you know, kind of various sectors of society. And I have to give a sermon that kind of aims at being meaningful for all of them on some level or another, and stimulating. And for me, that was a huge challenge, but it was a welcome challenge. So that's definitely been something that I was hoping to find, and I absolutely did, you know, when I got here. But there were things that I really didn't know about as far as the Jewish community is concerned. You know, I'm in the United States, and especially in New York, it's very open. There's not a lot of structure to the Jewish community. It's not a hierarchical kind of, you know, system. And here, everything is very centralized. There's a very clear hierarchy. in terms of its kind of governance and kind of authority and so on. And to me, that was a bit of a learning curve. It was very interesting. I wasn't sure how I felt about it, at the beginning. But there are parts of it that I think are really good, and parts of it that I think may be too structured for its own good, in certain regards. But again, coming from an American mentality, that's kind of how I see it from the outside. There was a lot that I learned about this community, but overall, I really do love the Jewish community here in the UK. I have a great affection for it.
Sure, and well, I hope you wouldn't say otherwise anyway on the way out. But it's really interesting though to hear, because there are, being a minister, and especially a minister in a community like ours, like the Spanish and Portuguese, I think you do have in the congregation an extraordinary mix of people, and often some of them are very established or high achieving people actually. And I don't know how common that is for other ministers. Do you get a sense of that?
I think it may be a bit more common here in London particularly, but it's not so common, right? It's not so common in general. And for me, like I say, that was something that I was it's a challenge, but it's a very welcome challenge.
You get a lot of feedback though.
I got a great deal of feedback, which it was funny because I had a rabbi who's a colleague of mine in New York. He came and did a guest lecture here. And he came over to me in the Kiddush, which is a gathering afterwards, where we kind of congregate and interact with each other. And he said, it's amazing, people coming up to me and commenting on my sermon. He said they've never done that before. And I love that, and sometimes, there's quite, there may be a bit of critique and so on. But for me, it's really helped me grow in my career, in my craft, to be able to have that. So overall, I'm very welcoming of that. And I'm very grateful for it. But yeah, I mean, it's a very diverse group.
And while you've been here, you've actually also been exploring other areas, haven't you? Outside of being a rabbi. Tell me a bit about what you've been studying and working towards whilst thinking about the next chapter.
Yeah, well, I mean, in general, I've always, really liked to explore various disciplines, and read broadly, as much as I could. But I've recently, well, I mean, the last 4 years really, I've started to study psychotherapy, and so I'm just about to complete a master's in psychotherapy. And it's funny because it's something that I had originally intended. I really didn't intend to become a rabbi, frankly, which my wife still has not forgiven me for.
But she comes from a rabbinic.
She comes from a very strong rabbinic, family. And she was very excited not to marry a rabbi. Unfortunately, it didn't work for her. So she said, and when we married, we married very young. I was 20 when we got married, and she was close to the end of 17. So I was planning to become a psychologist. And it didn't end up going that way. I had moved, I was living in LA, we were living in LA, and we had our first son. He was only a few months old. And I was invited to participate in a rabbinical college, where they paid the fellows but the deal was that they had to contribute back to the community, which was in New York, the Syrian community in New York. And I thought, okay, well, this is an opportunity for me to kind of, because I had always loved studying Jewish law and Jewish thought, but it's not what I wanted to do for a living, But I thought, okay, here's an opportunity for me to kind of complete those studies, and then continue my studies in psychology. And what ended up happening was I kind of took a job as a cantor, a chazan, for a new synagogue. The rabbi left that synagogue while I was there, and they asked me to fill in for him. And I did, and it ended up being 15 years, So that's.
Well, and you have a beautiful voice. I have to say again, another thing about being a community rabbi, you are part preacher, part singer, part spiritual leader, and part psychological leader. So I dare say that your background in psychology and further studies there is not really separate from...
It really isn't. I mean, for me, the reason I wanted to do that way back was because I'm fascinated by human psychology. And I really think, I'm sure we'll talk a lot, we'll talk about what's going on, in the world a bit. But, to me, I'm always looking at it from a psychological lens, so, politics, religion, sociology, they're all happening in the human mind, So for me to kind of have an insight into the human mind really, really is deeply interesting to me. And I can definitely say, it certainly has helped me in my rabbinic work on many levels. I mean, I've heard feedback that, when I include that kind of thing in a sermon, it matters to people, because for me, I want people to be able to kind of hear maybe what I might share and find something that they can actually apply to their life. And, you know, when I was younger, I would think a lot, well, what can I say to the people? And now I'm going to be 50 on Saturday.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's a thing, you know, but
It's out there.
yeah. But at this point, I really think what has helped me or what is helping me. And I kind of just offer that, you know, and I share that, you know. So that's that. Yeah, there's a big part of it for me that has helped me, you know, in every aspect, I would say.
I'd say 50 is a great age to start as a psychotherapist. I had the privilege of having a really wonderful therapist for some years in my life, Dr. Braffman, who was Jewish, and I always said to people, get someone with as much white hair as possible. They've seen everything. So I dare say, as a rabbi, you've probably done that too. So let me ask then about something which maybe is linked to your experience and thoughts about psychology of human beings. Fairly early on in your time here, a few years in, you got into a little bit of trouble with some comments you made specifically about homosexuality within the rigid hierarchical Jewish community. What happened?
Where does one begin with that? You know, it was quite jarring, you know, I will say. I did not expect it not to have some pushback. You know, I recognize that it was kind of a charged issue, certainly in the Orthodox Jewish community. I'll give a bit of background to it. I mean, what I was doing, you know, when I arrived here, I had started to give lectures weekly in the Hendon area, which is a very strong Jewish area, you know, Jewish community. And at the time, there were about 200 people that would attend these lectures a week. You know, so for me, that was boosting. You know, I certainly felt like, okay, you know, this is great. We've got, you know, people want to really engage and study, and it happened fairly early on. I mean, I was here only 3 years, and what we were doing was a series called Misconceptions. And each week I would present an idea that what might be misconceived in Judaism, right? What were Jewish thoughts, certainly in terms of kind of normative, you know, orthodox. And I noticed that any time that I was speaking to an audience between 20 and 30 years old, you know, this question came up. What about homosexuality as far as Judaism is concerned, the Torah is concerned? And this was asked to me not even by, you know, gay people in the audience, their friends, you know, who might have been straight, but nonetheless wanted to know, how does Judaism treat, you know, and it's interesting because we had a youth leader at the time who said to me, and he was, you know, an Orthodox youth leader who said to me, you know, with my peer group, if it's a question of, you know, Jewish law and adherence or inclusivity, we'll choose inclusivity every time. So I kind of felt that this wasn't really being discussed, you know, openly. I said, okay, well, I'll discuss it. You know, I'll present it, you know, kind of from what I understood the Jewish, you know, normative Orthodox Jewish approach. And I did. And what happened was, with no exaggeration, was an international backlash. You know, so Israel, the United States, and the UK, which I have relationships in each of those places, and presence in each of those places, very strongly pushed back on that.
So let me ask, without meaning to open up another international controversy. So what did you say?
What I said was, I mean, the general message was, look, you know, there are hard lines in terms of Orthodox Judaism, in terms of what might be allowed and not allowed. I said that, you know, attraction is not legislated, you know, in Jewish law. But I did say that we need to be more inclusive. And we need to recognize, you know, that there's a lot that we put onto it that isn't actually there, right, in terms of the Jewish legal.
That presumably has come from social norms historically.
For sure, that's you know, that's what I suggested. And it was an the class was audio recorded, like all the classes. And what happened?
You knew it was recorded.
I did know some sort of secret. I recorded it. Yeah, right. And what happened was, people had taken like clips out of it and out of context, and it was like thrown all over the world on WhatsApp, along with commentaries of, look what he's saying, look what he's doing, and so on and so forth.
And their assertion was that what you were saying was not in line with Orthodox.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was dangerous.
Was it?
I don't think that what I said was out of line. And my rabbis, you know, there were rabbis who said, look, you didn't say anything against law. It was more about how I said it, right? And there was a lot that I learned from this. I mean, there was a lot that I learned from this situation. First of all, it's very humbling, to say, which I welcome, can always use some humility. But I recognize several things, and this is only some of them. One of them was I didn't take into consideration my position as senior rabbi in this community, saying what I was saying. It was very political. There's no question about that. That was part of it. Meaning there were politics involved in terms of, the senior rabbi is saying this. He's representing Orthodox Judaism. Can we allow that to go without kind of pushing back on it?
So is there a sort of opportunism in that, insofar as there being this weird hierarchy in Anglo-Jewish structures? There's also some level of competition, I think it would be fair to say. So was there an attempt to jump on this and say, oh, we've got you on something?
I think to say that wasn't there wouldn't be honest. I think that there was an element of that in it, probably a significant element of that.
And to be fair, I've grown up in that community, for all of my life, before you were there and during your tenure. I've always found that the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community here has represented something of a small L liberal orthodoxy. And that's important to say. It is Orthodox Judaism, but it's been done in a very accepting and welcoming way, which I think is the Western Sephardi tradition that you were taking on when you became the senior rabbi. So was it a surprise to you that expressing effectively a halachically valid, in your opinion, perspective that was simply human and accepting caused such an uproar?
I was surprised at the level of backlash. I knew there would be, because I know it's a charged issue, but I was surprised at the level of it. And I do think much of it was political, but there was also fear involved. I mean, because I didn't take into consideration my position, that it wasn't just Joe Dweck, it was the senior rabbi saying this. What does that mean? Like, what kind of weight does that hold? Can we manage this as a Jewish community once it's been put out there? And I think the second thing, which I didn't mention, which was a huge thing that I learned, was I didn't talk to anybody before I did this, right? I have stakeholders, I have colleagues, at the time, the chief rabbi of Israel was my wife's uncle, I didn't talk to him before I did this. And I wasn't grateful. I wish he would have kind of, commented in a different way with it, but I also recognize that I dragged him into this.
So public, so they felt a response had to be public.
And that happened all over, right? So my colleagues in New York, the rabbinic colleagues in New York, were dragged into this issue. My teachers in New York were dragged into this issue. But the rabbis here.
If you'd had the conversations first, would you have been able to say what you did?
I think it would have been different. I think I might have had some advice. Look, say it this way, let us do this before you do it so that we can prep. I think there's something meaningful about that, because I wasn't acting in that regard as a team player. Not intentionally, but I think that I've learned a great deal how important it is when you're part of kind of a professional community, how you bring them in and take that into consideration. I also think, you also know who your friends are when something like this happens. And that's very, very important to cultivate, which at the time I had not valued as I think I should have.
So was it naivety or a touch of arrogance of youth?
I think it was both. Okay. I think it was arrogance. I think it was naivety. I think it was, I absolutely can say that I was not kind of savvy to the political playing field, that I almost liken it to, I nonchalantly roamed into a minefield, without.
In a sense, and I'll ask this bit because I think it's important to put the other side, perhaps, and then we'll move on to other topics. But was it a bit like "don't ask, don't tell"? That old US policy, which was to say that I mentioned that this community is very accepting and liberal, not in the sense of liberal Judaism, but in the sense of liberalness and acceptance. And as a gay person, I grew up in that community, and I was just commenting actually the other day that I have never once in my memory experienced any form of homophobia within, never mind actually my community, but in the Jewish community. And I engage with Orthodox Jews all the time. Of course, there will be some who would be critical or even rude to me, I'm sure, but those maybe aren't the places I mix in. But to me, it seemed that you were saying something out loud that our community had always represented, which is, it wasn't an issue in the synagogue, because I didn't make it an issue in the synagogue, speaking personally. if you don't bring that into the place, there was nobody who ever excluded me from anything. I've been invited to dinner with rabbis of many different colors and stripes. None has ever had a problem, even if I have gone with my husband. So I think that it seemed like you were actually speaking out for a portion of the Jewish community worldwide who weren't lucky enough to have my experience. And you were giving it, I suppose, a hechsha, to use the word incorrectly. And that was the problem, right?
I think that was a big part of the problem. And it is true. You know, I'm very glad to hear that you haven't had those experiences, but you and I both know that that's not, you know, across the board. You know, that's not the general situation. And I will say that since many people have reached out to me and have told me that class saved, if not saved their lives, some have said that to me, have really helped them, you know, in terms of just being able to gain some strength, you know, to be able to deal with things. So, you know, that's there too. But I was, you know, it was raised with me because I kind of said at the time, people aren't speaking about this. And many, you know, colleagues said, we do speak about it. We speak about it privately. So yeah, I mean, I think there was a lot involved. I think looking back on it, you know, I probably would have said it a bit differently. I would have been more sensitive, you know, to the circumstances, you know, in the broad form. You know, but I learned a lot from it.
Looking on the other side, are there things that you have done and said which have been a great success during your time here that you can look back on proudly? I mean, I'm not saying that one in a way. I hear what you're saying. You learned a lot, and it could have been done differently. But I would say that it wasn't entirely negative. But when you think back to these 11 years, 12, you said more even. I wonder how you feel, what you're most proud of having achieved in British Jewry.
First of all, I will say that I'm very, very grateful to the British Jewish community for welcoming me as they have. And, you know, I've done a lot of public speaking while I've been here. It's something that I enjoy doing. I think, you know, I'm grateful to, you know, have the opportunity to do it, to be invited to do. And so over the years, I've spoken, you know, every place, you know, I mean, there's, you know, in almost all of the, you know, synagogues, the main synagogues of the community. I mean, I've been invited to, you know, to participate that way in many areas, and it's been very well received, for the most part. I'm very grateful for that. So, you know, I've been able to kind of, you know, to teach in this community, you know, and to share thought and Jewish thought and Jewish ideas in this community, and they've been well received overall. And for me, that's I'm very grateful for that. I will probably continue to do that. You know, I even though we're moving, I will come back. I plan to come back quarterly to be able to do some teaching and lecturing, you know, in the community. And I've been very grateful for that kind of relationship that I've been able to have with the community in that way.
And more broadly, outside the Jewish community, let's talk about the British society and what's going on around us. So I know that a lot of people for some years have had concerns about rising anti-Semitism, but certainly since the 7th of October 2023, I think there's been shockwaves reverberating through not just British Jewry, but around the world. But speaking specifically about what's going on here, it's had, I would say, several effects. Some have been, if we can say, positive. It's united people, brought them even back to synagogue after the COVID lull that took a lot of people away and they never got back. But what's your broader vision as somebody that's been in this leadership position here? You interact internally with the community, but also externally in a sort of ambassadorial role. Do you see British society as having changed in the short time that you've been here? And if so, in what ways?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I do think it's changed. It's a short time. I mean, I've been here for a decade. And I will say, you know, I absolutely love living in London. I love this city. I love this country. Like I said, I'm an Anglophile. But I've seen it change. And again, I want to say, you know, I'm speaking from my empirical perspective. But it has changed. How has it changed? I feel, and I'm going to say I feel rather than I think, because it is an experiential feeling. You know, I feel that England, and maybe London specifically, is almost giving up on being England, you know, and being proud of being England. Why do I think that? Because, you know, I think there's a difference between multiculturalism and kind of a laying down and a fear of God forbid, disrespecting anyone's identity, anyone's position in society, and kind of just going, quiet as a society in the face of that. And I do feel that that is happening, to a significant degree in the UK, certainly in the city that we live in London, over the last 10 years. I definitely can say that, since October 7th, the protests that are happening weekly, and the disrespect that, we've seen from these protests, forget about to the Jewish people, but to English, to English society and culture and history and identity, to deface portraits and to deface statues of leaders and important people in British history, to me, and for it to kind of just go without much response. I worry about that, frankly. I worry about it not only because I love it, I love the UK and all of its, and the identity. We need it. We need the United Kingdom to be strong. We need the United States to be strong. We need the West to be strong. And I kind of feel that we are experiencing kind of this self-consciousness of being able to be boldly and proudly the West, in all of our uniqueness.
So
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, is it in a sense then, if I can just push it that bit further, it's not just a lack of confidence and pride in being Western, it's actually a slight embarrassment and apology for it.
Yeah, I would say I absolutely think that that's part of it.
And then at the same time, if I can identify the elephant in the room, then there are other parts of society which are not afraid to hide. They don't hide their light under a bushel. They're proud of who they are. They have completely different values and cultures and ethics to us, to those Western values, and they are increasing in size and proportion in our society. So it's at once this collapse of our own pride in our Judeo-Christian Western origins and achievements, and at the same time the growth of something which is very quick to criticize that and try to usurp it.
Yeah, it's more than criticism. I think there's absolute condemnation, and almost hatred, towards it. Maybe I'll say a resentment towards it, if not hatred, but I'm not sure that it's not there. Yes, and that worries me.
Coming from where?
Well, it's certainly coming from an Islamist extreme constituency. It's there. It's on the streets. It's at these protests. It's in society. It absolutely worries me, to see that, and kind of, the country. I mean, look, right after October 7th, because as you say, I have an ambassadorial role as well, and I represent the community to the broader society, to government. I was in Parliament for Hanukkah, and they had, they have, as usual, the various MPs and government officials speaking. And at the time they said, we will not allow for anti-Semitism to happen on our streets. And after October 7th, I felt emboldened by that. I was, oh, well, they're saying the right thing. That's what I want to hear.
How long did that last?
It didn't. It didn't happen, right? It didn't, I heard it there, and that's all I heard. And then a year later, I was there for Hanukkah, and they were saying the exact same thing. And I'm telling you in all honesty, Jonathan, it took every fiber of my being not to pipe up in the audience and say, when they said, we will not allow for anti-Semitism, again, a year later, not to say, but you're allowing it, right? It's happening on the streets weekly. So I've lost faith,
and you
a bit in that. I mean, I hope, we have a mutual friend who I was talking to, about this the other day, and he said, well, English society, they wait till the last minute, and I think the last minute has passed, frankly, because I don't know that the momentum and, as you say, the increasing nature of, the population and presence is something that kind of can be put back and kind of reeled in, so to speak, for lack of a better term. So,
well, my friend Dr. Einat Wolf actually puts this well. She says, often Western societies do wait for the last minute. But as Jews, she says, we have a timing problem. Often we're the first casualty.
Oh, yeah.
And so they might fix it, but that might be a bit late for us. And I think our history has shown that we can't really afford that gamble. So would you say in that respect then that the UK has failed? Is it something that can be fixed?
I'm an optimist at heart. Genuinely. I really do like to and try to find the positive in a situation and to kind of latch onto that. Not to be blind to the negative. But I will say to you, Jonathan, it's hard for me in this situation. I am not all-knowing, I don't know. So when I say that I don't know how they're going to come back from this, it's not to say that they can't. I don't know what's in the cards or what potentially may be able to happen. Look, I mean, I think the fact that we're seeing the rise of the Reform Party now is, very interesting. I think the meager attempts of the government to kind of respond to that, say, oh, we're gonna change immigration law, by making people be able to speak English. I'm worried about it. I don't know if it's going to be able to be brought back. I would like to believe that that it's strong enough to be able to, but
I think I was going to say we're all optimists. I'm not sure that is true.
I don't know.
But I think as Jews, I think our history teaches us to hope for the best, plan for the worst, as they say. And that is really optimism in a realist mold. But that's my question, is what, as somebody that's been in a leadership position in a religious institution, and you're bold enough to say there is an Islamist tendency behind some of this problem, and I would also add, as I'm sure you'd agree, there's been an element of an alignment with the far left, which also has interests in
it's fertile ground for
attacking the same sort of structures of society, and they've made this strange alliance. But
very strange.
If that is the case, what are the practical things that you could imagine might start to fix this, when some of the practical challenges are not just the ideology, but also demographics and birth rates, and not just immigration, but immigration as well? There are so many elements to this. I know you're not a politician, but how would you recommend to start fixing it?
I am not a politician. Let's be clear on that. Say it twice. But look, I think what it will require is a firm owning and reclaiming of British identity. And it will require some very uncomfortable things, and certainly things that in modern, in our current society would be deemed perhaps even politically incorrect to do. But there will need to be, identity requires boundaries. If I don't know who I am, like where I begin and where I end, I can't get into a relationship. I won't know how to be able to maintain my integrity in that relationship. I can't really be able to hold myself if I don't have clarity on that. And it means that there will be certain situations in which I will say to people, no, you will not speak to me that way. No, you will not treat me that way. I will not put myself into this situation. It's very uncomfortable for human beings to do that if they don't have a very firm sense of identity, to be able to set those boundaries. The country will need to do that if it's going to be able to maintain its identity. And that means setting firm boundaries and saying a firm no to certain things, which it seems to me they're having trouble doing right now. So it may say, no, we're not letting these people into the country. No, we're not keeping these people in the country. No, we're going to insist that, if you're going to come in, this is how it is that we expect you to behave in these particular...
So in a sense, in terms of immigration, I think what you're saying is integration, assimilation. But again, as a largely immigrant community, British Jews did do some of those things in large part, and yet maintained their own culture and values, as I think Jews have done in diaspora life across the world. So I think we consider ourselves a good example.
I think we're a very good example. I wrote an article, after Syria was, basically taken down, about that specifically, because I'm a Syrian Jew. My family lived in Aleppo for 500 years before coming to the United States in 1901. And the Syrian Jews, and I think broadly Jewish people in general in various levels, right? We've done this fairly well, in which we have been able to maintain culture, identity, richness of heritage, while at the same time very significantly investing in the society in which we live. And to learn, a balance in terms of what it is that we kind of contribute to, assimilate in the sense of bring in, right? and to contribute, that way. And it's something that the Jewish people have done for many years. For not sometimes against our will, but we've done it. And I think that that is a very good model, actually.
And they like to use the word disproportionate when talking about us. But I think, as you're pointing out there, the Jewish contribution to Western society, to British society, is absolutely disproportionate. When you look around, even places like the community that you are still the leader of, there are luminaries of various different disciplines and careers in that very room every Saturday. So
absolutely.
I think there's no denying that. And I think, again, we should be proud of that. That's not something we should, I can't take credit for every Jew's achievements in our society, but it's part of our culture. But it seems like you're talking there about some of the things that immigrants or those who are coming to this country might do differently. But you also said that you need to have a good sense of your identity and yourself. You've got to know that. And it sounds like you think Britain and Britons don't anymore. So is that the case? And what is that identity that they should reclaim?
Yeah, I am not sure that's, that it is as strong as it could or should be. I think there's a certain self-consciousness about, British history, the imperial colonial aspect of the country's, recent history. Which I really think that they grapple to square.
Because there's a shame there?
I think there's an element of shame to it.
And is it justified?
I think that there's an element of it that's justified. But, again, it's one of the reasons why I am interested in psychotherapy, because psychotherapy, if done well and done, effectively, helps to process and integrate what otherwise shame, trauma, that otherwise paralyzes us or inhibits our ability to be able to live whole, robust lives. And I think that the country is having a lot of trouble dealing with that past. And it's almost like a pendulum swinging. So instead of kind of working through it and understanding, look, this is things that we have to own and take responsibility for and apologize for even. But, these are the good things, that we have, and to recognize those and own those as well. What's kind of happening is God forbid we should disrespect anyone, lest we be called, negative words and negative names. And so we kind of just let all things happen, which is nothing but, a miscellany, homogeny, and nothingness. So yeah, I think there's a big problem there. And you asked, I'll just say, because you had asked, what do I think it is or it should be, I've said before, and I could get in trouble for this, but when I came here as an American, what was difficult for me was to find, what is the British ideal? Because as an American, you are raised, at least my generation, you are raised on freedom. America is about freedom. So when I was in school, still we were saying a Pledge of Allegiance to the flag every morning. You knew that to be an American meant that you cared about freedom and and freedom of speech, freedom of life. And we don't sing a national anthem to the king or to the monarch. We sing, about our country and the flag and freedom. So when I came here, I wanted to see, well, what is Britain about? And I couldn't find it at first, to be frank. And then I realized, as all good English things, they're understated. And I found that the patron saint of England is St. George. And St. George is depicted by, he's riding a white horse and he's spearing either a serpent or a dragon or whatever, it depends on the depiction, which clearly, represents the triumph of good over evil. And, looking at British history, World War I and World War II in recent history, they have been on the right side of history, because I do believe that does run deep in the soul of this country. There is a commitment to the fight of good over evil in a very serious way. Certainly as manifest in the Second World War and under the leadership of Churchill. That is what this country is about.
Well, is it still? I mean,
I'm saying that is what the country is about. That is what is at the heart of it, and that is what needs to be reclaimed. There needs to be a clarity about that. I think that we are in a crisis of leadership. One of the things that Churchill did was not just, manage and lead the war and in the tactics of war. He spoke to the country. He went out into the streets after every night of the Blitz to be with the people. He spoke to the people about why we're doing what we're doing. And he said it again and again and again. I say often, I believe in preaching to the choir. We actually have a choir in our synagogue. And I think it's important to preach to the choir because it's important for them to remember why they're singing.
Yeah.
And we don't have that.
Well, it's my friend Melanie Phillips said it to me years and years ago when I once said to her, I'm worried I'm preaching to the choir. She said, well, they might stop singing if you don't.
Yeah.
So I think that is part of it. But on the other hand, I think that as Jews, we've realized that we also need to look outwards. And I think we had, particularly as British Jews, since I grew up here, a sense that, Judaism is something you do at home, not quite as it is in France with religions, but it's something you do at home. It's part of your core and your inner everything. But, it might enter into your day-to-day. But generally speaking, head down, don't make too much of a fuss. And now we live in a society, I think, where minority groups trade on victimhood and special treatment, whether it is, so-called LGBTQ plus movement expecting special treatment, whether it is the creation of ever new victim groups who claim they require special treatment. And I think as Jews, we've not done that. So there's now this risk that I want to ask you about of, should we start engaging in that too? Or should we stick with what we're doing and keep contributing in this sort of quiet way, but it doesn't seem to be working?
It's interesting because that's another thing, when I first arrived here, as an American Jew, specifically from New York, where Jews are very out loud, open, and kind of not at all kind of quiet or ashamed. I remember a member of the community driving me down, I think it was Finchley Road, where they had just built the new JWII, the Jewish Community Center, and it's quite prominent on the road. And they say, "Oh, this is our new community center." I said, "Oh, that's great." And they said, "Yes, but it's quite prominent on the road in a kind of a negative way." I was like, "That's tremendous," and I realized then, really. So much of the kind of British Jewish mentality, right? It is head down. As a matter of fact, someone told me about, our oldest synagogue, Bevis Marks, which is in the city of London, over 300 years old, still lit by candlelight, absolutely exquisite, told me that it was built not in the center of the city in order to be able to be inconspicuous. I was told that, our musical liturgy, which is quite Western and much of it quite anglicized, was kind of fashioned purposefully so that people passing by shouldn't hear strange music coming from, what otherwise was surrounded by the churches. That's a very strong legacy, kind of, inherited legacy of British Jewry. We need to stop that. We absolutely need to stop that. There's no question in my mind that we need to stop it. I don't think that we need to be victims. That's wrong. I don't think we should be victims. Victimhood is not effective. But we need to be much more prominent, and we do punch above our weight in terms of our presence in this country for a reason. We've contributed tremendously to this country, and we really do need to be able to be stronger, prouder, if we want to be able to kind of keep our rich Jewish life that we do live here strong and prominent.
So we've contributed, as you say, to the history and society. In what ways would you say that Jewish thought and teaching has contributed and shaped Western ideals and values that are now so at risk?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly am not the first to say this. The former chief rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacerdoti, was very well known for saying this, pointing out, that Jewish thought, that the Jewish Bible, strangely, which belonged to, this arbitrary group of tribes in the desert, became, the most famous and most influential book in the world, absolutely has influenced Western society. Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, the historian, he wrote a book recently called Dominion, which is a great book. And his thesis of the book is that if you were Western, you're a Christian. Why? Because if you've grown up in the West, you can't but think like a Christian, because Christianity has kind of formed the entire psyche of the West. And I say to that, then you're also a Jew, because, Christianity, although it has some elements of paganism incorporated in it, it is deeply based on Judaism, right? And Jewish thought and the Jewish Bible. As a matter of fact, I was, just last night with somebody who's a devout Christian who said, he literally pulled the Bible out of his pocket. I said, he was supporting a Jewish cause. And I said, well, why you're here? He said this. He goes, see the first part? That's all the Jews, So we need to own that as well, and I think be recognized and be proud of that as well. It has been a formidable fabric for the development, progress, and strength of Western society, and that's something not only to be proud of, but to implement and to kind of promulgate.
So obviously, the basis of Western values on Christianity, the basis of Christianity being Judaism.
Well, it's not Judaism, it's based on Judaism.
Yeah, but the basis of it is based on Judaism, with obviously changes that Jews did not accept.
Correct. Yeah.
So I'm not trying to get you in more trouble.
Yeah, no.
But I suppose I do want to then challenge that with the rise in popularity of Islam in Western societies. And I will say this: a lot of people talk about a kind of growing influence of Islam at the more extreme end of the attempt to introduce Sharia into day-to-day life, even for non-Muslims in Western places. And this has all more or less taken place, to put it broadly, in totally legitimate legal ways. A growth of a particular way of thinking in our society, using our systems of freedoms, which you quite rightly point out we're proud of, seems to many to be threatening our Western way of life. Do you think that is a fair fear that British people have, that Jews have, that non-Muslims have, that Britons and Westerners have?
It can be. It can be. I think about it. I'm a, like I said, a Syrian Jew. My family lived in Syria for many centuries. And they did so peacefully and in friendship, really, with the Arabs there. And frankly, it wasn't good, once the state of Israel was established. But my community, the majority of them left not because of persecution, but because of business problems. The Suez Canal was opened and collapsed business. And you'll know also that I'm a staunch Maimonidean, right? So the center of my Jewish world in thought is Moses Maimonides, 12th century Spanish scholar. And he lived in Muslim Andalusia in Spain, had to leave when he was 20, ended up settling in Cairo, in Egypt. And during that time, there were definitely extremist Islamist tribes, but it was also a time in which the enlightened world was the Muslim world at that time. The Christian world was running into the dark ages at that time. Greek philosophy was being translated into Arabic. Yeah. There is a potential for Islam to own that tradition and to bring it into the 21st century. And that is something that I would and do, if I can, encourage, So recently we signed these drumland rig accords with imams and rabbis. That was kind of spearheaded by my friend Imam Sayyid Razavi, who's the chief imam of Scotland. And people asked me, you had asked me at the time, well, why did I do this? Am I not concerned about, the Islamist aspects of it? I'm absolutely concerned with that. The reason why I did that and participated in that was because I do believe that this can be an Islamic, maybe reform is a strong word, but an Islamic move into that legacy, right? To reclaim that legacy and to bring it into the 21st century. I am concerned about that, right? So I support it when I see overtures to it. I think it needs to be supported, but I am concerned about it because, and I'm not a scholar of Islam, I say that, frankly, it doesn't, in my mind, easily lend itself to interpretation, progress, and development. I remember sitting on a panel in front of hundreds of people at a convention in Milan with an imam who's a colleague, and he said, Judaism is God's prophecy 1.0, Christianity is 2.0, and Islam is 3.0 and perfect, and it need not be changed. And that is, Jonathan, so antithetical to Jewish thought, because traditional normative Orthodox Jewish thought, which is what I represent and I claim to be part of, definitely recognize the Bible as prophetic and the Word of God, but we also see it in terms of covenant, which means that we, the human side, right, the personal side, is part of that, right? Which means interpretation, application, development. I mean, we have a whole concept in Jewish thought called chidush, which means new, right? Always strive to find something new, something that hasn't been spoken of before. And when I heard that, it really concerned me because it first of all bases itself on a fundamentalist type narrative and thought, right? You are more praiseworthy, more religiously sound if you look at the text literally unadulterated and take it as is. Islam means submission. Yeah. It's not to say that it's not possible for Islam to kind of, be more enlightened and developed and engage with the world that God created, frankly. I think as a religious person, that's how I look at it. God created this world, it's not an elaborate distraction. It's supposed to be integrated, which is why we integrate. So my hope and prayer is that Islam can find its way into that legacy and really own it. I worry about it being able to do that because of that mentality, right?
And that mentality,
and it's a fundamental, I'll just close by saying it's a fundamentalist mentality that lends itself to extremism. And to say that I'm worried about extremism is an understatement. It is wreaking havoc in the world. And I don't think that we're doing enough to fight it and to call it what it is and to combat it. And frankly, I will go so far as to say I think that it's gone out of fashion to call evil evil. We can't even use that word anymore. But I do, and I think that we need to, because there are certain acts and ideologies that are, yeah.
So you say that fairly central part of Islam lends itself at times to extremism.
Yeah.
I might use the words tends towards extremism, because there is something, if people talk about fundamental Islam or radical Islam, it seems to me that is a belief system, as I understand it as a non-Muslim, it is quite fundamental and radical and extreme in its core. So the question is then, yes, we want to encourage a moderate version of Islam that allows us to exist, for example, where extreme Islam might think of us as Jews or non-Muslims as worthy of conversion or something far worse. Why is it our job as Jews, even your job as a Jewish leader, to encourage that rather than to observe it and hope for it? Isn't it our job, actually, as citizens of the world, to call out evil where we see it, even if it's justified by people who claim it's the carrying out of their faith in its most absolute and true form?
Absolutely, yes.
So why sign the Accords?
I signed the Accords because, like I said, if there is a pathway or even an overture towards moderate, more enlightened approaches to Islam, in other words, if we shut the door to Islam's attempts at trying to come into a more moderate, enlightened place, I think that's a mistake, right? I think that it should be recognized and we should be open to it. And I can completely appreciate the arguments otherwise. Maybe we're playing with fire. Maybe it's, I can completely recognize that. That was my thinking going into it, for right or wrong. I think, but I think there's a bit more here that is important to recognize, because we're talking about extremism, but, the extremism is happening in many arenas in the world, right? The most dangerous kind, very much, is happening in Islamist extremist, factions, because they are death cults and they absolutely have no problem about murdering and torturing people. That's a big, huge problem.
And what do they shout while they do it?
Oh, Allahu Akbar.
Right.
God is great. So it's all in God's name, right? It's all in God's name.
They're very clear what and why they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
But I think we need to also recognize the trend in the world at large that is gravitating towards extremes. And why is it gravitating towards extremes? I think it's important to be able to pay attention to that as well.
So you feel we're gravitating towards extremes as well on the other side of this?
Who's we?
Well, Jews, Western society.
Yes.
And what are those extremes?
I do. I think that, there is definitely, within the small Jewish world, in my lifetime, which I've definitely seen a gravitating towards either further liberal openness on one side or real staunch, strict right-wing, stringent Judaism on the other side. I consider myself a centrist moderate for the most part. And I think my fellow centrists are collectively feeling that we are struggling to hold center. And that wasn't always the case. I think, it was always kind of a challenge because, you have to think about things carefully at the center. You can't just toe party line, but it's becoming increasingly difficult to hold the center. So I do think that that's happening. I think it's happening in the West. I think, the election of Trump on a certain level is a stamp of that, right? Trump, he definitely speaks in extremist language. It's not, it's its own brand and its own kind, but he definitely is able to do so because he's responding to an extremist left that is saying things that have gotten so, this has been very, very openly recognized. The left had got so extreme in what they're calling wokeness, and their assertions on the left, that he was able to speak extremely on the right and be able to be elected for it because, the country in general wanted to do that. I think one of the problems is that the world is developing at lightning speeds, and the diversity, nuance of the nature of reality is moving at lightning speeds, and we really don't know what to do with it. We're not able to keep up with it. And we don't like, as human beings, being uncertain and not knowing what we think about something and how to categorize something. So a lot of what's happening, I believe, is that we're digging our heels into what we know in face of, just this explosion of newness and diversity that we don't quite know what to do with. I'm not saying that is the only answer to what's going on, but I think it has a great deal to do with what's going on.
Isn't it the case, though, because what you just said about Trump is interesting to me.
Yeah.
I remember jumping up and down with glee at my desk watching the inauguration speech, because the man said, from now on in America there are two genders, male and female. And then after I'd calmed down a bit, I thought, how extraordinary that in 2025 I am excited by a politician who can simply express the most obvious factual binary that humankind has known since its origin, whatever you believe that origin to be, and yet he's the extremist. So the point is that I think that could we not say that the left has moved so far, or society at large has moved so far in this wokeness, that actually it's now extreme to hold positions which 20, 30, 40 years ago, or for the rest of humanity's history, were basic common sense and truths. And now, sure, he's an unusual figure, but to have such a person state simple truths, for example, to remove funding from universities for overt, basically riots and pogroms, it's not an extreme measure. Actually, it's a logical common sense.
It's a common sense measure
to fix a radical and extreme problem. So why must we, let's say, those of us who are often told we're on the right, accept the label of extreme for what is actually, not that long ago in our living memory, completely ordinary, and I would say still the view of the majority of people.
Look, I don't mean to say that everything that Trump says is extreme. I think he says extreme things. I think for him to say, we're renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, even if it's just for rhetoric, that's something that in my lifetime I would not have seen a politician, president of the United States,
taking over Canada.
We're going to take over Canada. It should be a 51st state.
For sure.
I'm going to take a plane from Qatar, and don't be an idiot and look at gift. These kinds of things, to me, are extreme, right? They are extreme. For whatever reason he may be doing it. Once we get into, well, he's doing it because of this, is already, okay, well, you're kind of putting it into the frame of why it's happening. It's happening. And it's not something that I saw happening, right? As far as I was been watching presidents be inaugurated. I don't think that the binary, the thing about gender was an extreme statement. But he does make extreme statements. And I think you can say that it's only a response to the left. I think it's a phenomenon itself. I think that the gravitation towards extremes is in part a response to a world that is so not defined, right? And so developing so rapidly that we really don't know what to do with it. And our response is hold on to what you know and double down. you know? So I worry, again, I don't know how many times I said I worry in this interview, but I think that my concern is, in all of this kind of strong, extreme-natured rhetoric, what's happening to the center? I worry about the center.
Well, listen, about saying worry, we live in worrying times.
Yeah,
There's no doubt about that. And I think that, you know, you and I...
But we need, as you say, we need to do something about it.
Right, and we're of a similar age. I think that we were lucky to grow up in an era where we assumed all the post-Second World War liberties that we enjoyed, lack of anti-Semitism in our day-to-day lives as modern Westerners, whether it was in the United States or here.
It was a status quo.
Status quo.
We also grew up in peacetime, which is the rarest.
Correct, and automatic, that they were not, I think we forgot that people fought very hard so that we would enjoy them, and we assumed that that battle had been won and they were forever to be enjoyed. I think, you know, I spend a lot of time warning about a lot of things, and people, especially within the Jewish community, would call me mad or extreme or fascist. All of these hurt me because I don't believe those positions are, and I think that many of them, I think you probably share many of the concerns I've had. Since October the 7th, they don't think that anymore. The vast majority of people who told me that, some of them came and apologized. I don't care for apologies. I didn't need that. But this is where we live. For the rest of our lives, I believe we're going to live in that world where we need to do something.
Absolutely.
We need people and leaders who will do something. And so I'm not here to endorse Trump or to get you to do so. But the worry that I think you're expressing is one that we all share. And I'd like to hear from a sort of Jewish thinking. What should we do in such an era? We as Jews have lived through worse, for sure. And we are faced with a world that has lost its way, a society that's lost its identity, that's lost its pride. It's identified the things it should be ashamed of and forgotten the things it should be proud of. Often they're the same thing, two sides of the same. But what's your teaching then going forwards for Jews who have found a new unity in their response to this, but also to the rest of society? What should we learn? What should be our outlook? Selling extreme moderation, as you're saying, is virtually impossible. You won't beat this with moderation, and you also won't get people to opt for moderation when they feel they're confronting an extreme. So it's a long question, but I guess my question to you is, as a Jewish leader, as a rabbi, and a psychologist, and a
psychologist, almost a
psychotherapist. What's the core? What's the way through this?
Well, I think there's a few points. First of all, with the Jews, I am glad that the Jews are unified in a way that I have not seen in my life. I am saddened that what has been the catalyst for that has been tragedy and loss. I do believe that the Jewish people have a connection between them that is unspoken, even when we are quite at odds with each other. You know, that's part of our tradition as well. You know, we are a questioning people. You know, the jokes that people always tell about, you know, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, 1 Jew on a deserted island and 2 synagogues, one that he goes to, one that he won't step foot in. You know, that's the Jewish way, because we've been trained to ask and challenge. So we do that sometimes, you know, to our detriment with each other. But I think at the core, we know that we're a family. And you know, my non-Jewish friends kind of brought to my attention something I hadn't thought about. You know, they say, you know, the Jewish people are tremendously unified. And this is before October 7th, you know, having nothing. I said, what do you mean? He said, you know, I saw, like, you know, if somebody's sick, everybody prays for them. You know, they don't even know who this person is. And, you know, Jews will be praying for people that they have no idea who they are. You know, that brought to my attention perhaps, you know, how it is that we are and how we might be seen on the outside. I pray that, you know, Jewish unity continue. I think that, you know, it's in our nature to be at strife with each other. And it's sad that it takes tragedy for us to be able to unify as we do. But we need to hold that unity in some capacity. And it goes back to a question of leadership for me as well. I'm dismayed that, you know, central Jewish leadership is not doing more, again, like we said, to preach to the choir of the Jewish public and encourage unity more prominently. Whenever I get an opportunity on my small platform to do that, you know, that's an important part of my message, I think. So I think one is that. I think we need to hold together, even in our, strong ideas and, the differences of opinion. We need to find the commonality without sacrificing our ideas and opinions and hold to that. It's very important to be able to hold that fabric. Jewish tradition also is, like I say, an arguing, challenging tradition. So our prophets were not submissive, right? Our prophets were devout. Our prophets dedicated their lives to God, but they also argued with God from Moses on down. Moses is introduced into the text in his prophecy as going, toe to toe with God on his first job, on his first thing. Our prophets argue with God. Our prophets run away from God. Our prophets are firm in their ideas and wrestle with their ideas. I think that's something that we also have to come back to. We can be unified and we can be, moderate, but at the same time, fight for what we need to fight for. We need to fight. We need to fight again. We need to be able to be bold enough and brave enough, courageous enough to fight for what is right, and not to doubt what is right, and what it needs to be. We really do need to do that. And I think that that's something that society needs to do. And I think that that should draw from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I'm grateful to those who are. I'm grateful to people like you who are speaking out. But we really need to get our wits about us and move into that space.
I always think that Judaism's questioning background actually is quite fundamental to our way of being, and quite an important lesson that maybe we can contribute. Because where you said Islam means submission, Israel means struggle with God, and so I think that that's the Jewish tradition, in a sense, as I was taught it. In my opinion, and maybe it's heretical to say so to the rabbi, I don't know, but I believe Abraham failed when he submitted, told to sacrifice your son on an altar. I think that test is one that you fail when you say yes. And so to me, I've always felt like actually my understanding of Judaism has been that we question everything. In fact, even sometimes the less orthodox will mock the orthodox by saying you found a loophole in a law that lets you, turn on your light on Shabbat by rotating something so the light is obscured or not obscured. If God really wanted you not to turn on a light, why do you think you're so smart for having...
Which misses the point. Right. Yeah, it misses the point. I think, I don't know if I agree about, that particular episode with Abraham, but I think Abraham is the father of the Jewish people because of his fights with God, because of his struggles. When God says, listen, I'm going to take out Sodom, what say you? And you would expect a devout man like Abraham to say, whatever your will, God.
Right.
And instead what he gets is an entire argument that goes on for a while for
Moses as well.
Yeah. That is absolutely, part of our tradition. And I think, what you talk about with regards to Jewish law, it's not what if God wanted then. Like I said before, the whole point is covenant. Covenant is bipartisan. It is dual, right? It's both parties. It is God inviting us and saying, listen, here are my principles. What do you say about my principles? How do you apply them into your life, into your situation? Let's work together on this. That is Jewish tradition. And I think, that's, you don't have the high percentage, the famous high percentage of Nobel laureates that you do if you also shut down the questioning, challenging nature of, the Jewish spirit.
That's interesting. And in a sense, I think that element of Jewish learning, I remember actually when I was at university, I did a section on hypertext, which was still relatively new back then. And they taught us, when they were talking about hypertext and how it works, the very basis of the original internet, links that go off in multi-directions, non-linear thinking, they literally showed us a page of the Talmud and said, this is the prototype for hypertext, because you have the text and then you have around it all of the different nodes. And I remember thinking, gosh, that's extraordinary. And I believe they even teach Talmud in Japan, I think, on this.
I think Korea,
Korea, sorry. So certainly, I think Jewish thought has contributed that. And I think that, our Bible is obviously the basis of the two other great faiths that have been great in number, have been developed as well since. So I think that it's an important message. And all the worries that you have expressed, I hope are ones that we can overcome.
I'm still optimistic. I am still hopeful, really. I'm still hopeful. And, but hope requires action as well.
And I want to say, though, that in that struggle, as we're coming to a close, back to you mentioned earlier that you signed these accords between 6 imams and 6 rabbis. And I was a little critical, as you know, in our private conversations, because I think
That's very Jewish of you.
well, so I'll do it a bit more openly now if you're willing to discuss it. And, if we're treading too close to any lines, say so. But I found it problematic because while, of course, I want to create a more cooperative and collaborative world between faiths, I do fear when there is a faith which in its quite mainstream practice has a lot of people who literally want to kill me because of who I am. And most faiths, it's actually Mossab Hassan Yusuf, the son of Hamas, as he's known, the Green Prince, who said this to me sitting in this room having a similar conversation. He said, Islam has a lot of rules for people who aren't Muslim. Judaism doesn't. We have some Noahide rules for people who wish to adopt Jewish style practice.
And if they wish to abide even by those rules, right?
Yeah.
It's not like,
For sure.
Yeah.
So I suppose my question is, when it comes to something like the Accords, one of the parts of it that offended me was a commitment not to criticize each other's holy figures. Now, I'm happy if anyone criticizes our scriptural holy figures. In fact, I just did it. I criticized Abraham. You pushed back. We all know what happens if you're too critical of Islam's holiest figure.
Yeah.
And I felt that it's a commitment on our part to do something that we shouldn't commit to do. And I think that it's also, as you said, a give and take where we aren't really in debt. Why are we giving? If Islam needs to modify and moderate, I agree with you. Let's support the people who are doing so. But why do we need to pretend that we're moderating and holding back something of ourselves when we're either not doing it or we're correct to do it, to criticize a religion's beliefs if they feel wrong to us in a respectful way? Should be our obligation, shouldn't it? When we live in a society where those beliefs are regularly used to blow up our children in a pop concert or stab people or kidnap or rape, why on earth shouldn't we criticize respectfully in mutual dialogue Islam's holy figures?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I can't say that I disagree. I do agree with you with regards to that. And yet I signed, which maybe would be your next point, and yet you signed. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I don't think that, that we should be prohibited from, as you say, respectfully criticizing something that we think really does need to be criticized. And I think ultimately freedom of speech is a cardinal foundation stone of the West. And I still hold that. Even as signing those accords, I hold that. I interpreted that as more along the lines of disrespectful criticism. I interpret it that way. Maybe I'm used to interpretation, right? And they're not. So that's what happened. But that's how I interpreted it. And that's how I go into it, really. That's how I go into it. But I do agree with you, as far as that's concerned. And it is not without concern and problem. The whole relationship right now in the world with Islam, its future and its behavior is not without problem. And I am in no way blind to that, or not even, I would say I'm quite vigilant, in my thinking and watching it with regards to it. We need to be.
So let me ask you now more directly about Israel, where you're going to go and live. At the moment, in this country and in pretty much, as far as we can see, the States and around many parts of the West, Israel is under extreme criticism for allegations such as genocide and apartheid. You're going to go and live somewhere that is accused of these worst of crimes that humanity can commit. What is your response to a society that we're living in that says these things about Israel, the Jewish state?
Well, I mean, on a personal level, they are, in my opinion, absolutely categorically false. I'm very confident in that. I think to use the term genocide in this particular, in this situation is a degradation and a cheapening of the word. which is not something that we're not used to seeing today. I mean, there's a cheapening of words all over the place because there's no standards anymore in terms of who we call Hitler and what we call Nazi and what we term genocide. This is a war. It is a just war after an absolutely heinous attack by Hamas, and people are not used to seeing war the way that they're seeing it. If I were to look at it and be most generous in my response to that criticism. So, I'm quite confident with regards to that. And I'm very grateful to the people in the public sphere who are speaking very strongly against, this idea of it being a genocide. The fact that it's an apartheid, state is laughable to me. I mean, I don't know how many of those people have actually been to Israel and see it. When I walk through the streets of Jerusalem and I see every kind of person on the streets freely walking around, Muslim included, when I know that if I were to set foot in, the occupied, or the West Bank and Gaza, I would be taking my life into my hands. I personally know people who were murdered by, being in those places simply to visit Rachel's tomb, and didn't come out alive. So to me, it is outrageous, actually, that those terms are used. I think it is absolutely indicative of how morally confused, to give it a generous term, we've become at this point, in society. And I am very confident about being there and contributing to its society. I'm proud of Israel. I think it's one of the great stories in modern history in terms of its success and development. And I'm quite proud of that, yeah.
And yet, here in the UK, it's becoming more mainstream to hold those opinions. Even, not that long ago, I gave evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee, Parliamentary Foreign Affairs Committee. I was actually taken aback, maybe I shouldn't have been, by not just the level of aggression, but the sort of style of questioning and the lack of actual any knowledge that our politicians have. What do you see as being behind that political shift towards, for example, criticizing Israel for its conduct in this war, for criticizing Israel as the ICC now, as we mentioned earlier, there's this case against the Prime Minister of Israel and the specific charges that he's using starvation as a weapon of war on the people of Gaza. These are truly hideous allegations, but as far as we can tell, with no actual basis in fact. And they're being leveled at Israel and Israeli leaders, as far as I can see, I want to know if you agree, as archetypal Jews, as the country of Jews. The Jew is once again responsible for the worst things that humans can do. And our politicians are either subscribing to those beliefs or going along with them for political expediency.
Yeah. I'm sad to say that I think it would be a mistake not to recognize anti-Semitism at the roots of those, of those ideas, sentiments, and approaches. I did see, the evidence, the footage of the evidence you gave. I was also taken aback, mostly by the chair, in her arrogance and disrespect. I mean, if they're coming to ask you for evidence and testimony, it seemed to me that they had already made up their minds before you had even opened your mouth, to be able to speak about it. There are atrocities, real atrocities going on around the world that we struggle to find any information about. And yet Israel is looked at in the way that it's looked at and spoken about the way it's spoken about. I do think that anti-Semitism is at the roots of it. And yet I don't think that is new. I really do think that for, the last 80 years, it has been socially unacceptable to be publicly anti-Semitic in the way that we're seeing today. And what's happening is it has now become okay to lose the self-consciousness around anti-Semitism and being publicly anti-Semitic. That scares me, frankly. It scares me. But I really do think that that's a significant part of it.
So as you're coming to the end of your time in the UK, do you think Jews have a future here?
It's a hard question for me to answer. I want to believe in the future of the community here. I think there will need to be some real significant efforts made by the community if they wish to continue strong Jewish life here. But I also recognize that there are many variables that happen in history that I can't account for. But if things are running as they are now, in the trajectory that they are running, save black swans that could come in that you and I don't know about, the Jewish community needs to step up its game, I would say. I would say particularly in two areas. I mean, there was a JPR survey that was put out some months ago to, I think it was Jewish Britons between the ages of 20 to 35, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about the specific demographic, in which they were asked, what is to you the most important part of your Jewish identity? The number one answer was Friday night dinner. The number two answer was Holocaust education. And
When was this?
it must have been last year, maybe, right? Not much longer than that.
It's good. Although the first one is a positive.
Yes, I think, and I could be wrong about that. It could have been before October. I'm not 100% sure because you know, it's swimming in my head, right? Yeah. What was important to me was the statistic, right? That the number one thing was Friday night dinner, and I think that's important because what it does is say that culture, family, heritage is important. And then the second one is a negative of, you know, fight against anti-Semitism. I would be concerned about that in our current climate because Friday night dinner is not enough to be able to ensure a robust Jewish future. It really does. I'm an educator at heart. I'm an educator. I've taught from 5-year-olds to 95-year-olds, formal education, informal education for the last 25 years. Education is a very important thing to me. I don't think it's the be all and end all anymore. When I was younger, I did. I thought just educate and save everybody. Family is very important in terms of a robust Jewish future. Families need to hold their Judaism, their Jewishness central. It has to be something that they really give to their children in a proud and strong way. If that's not there, you could educate from now till tomorrow. I don't know that I'm not sure that it would hold. But I think we need both. We need Friday night dinner and we need family to be strong. We also need strong Jewish education. We need to, and what I mean by that is not necessarily Talmud for every Jewish child. But I do believe that, Jewish children should be taught the Bible, just as their own inheritance. I mean, it's the strongest, most influential book in the world. Let them at least know it. Let them do what they will with it, but give it to them. It's their inheritance. Don't steal it from them. Jewish children should be taught basic Hebrew. It's our national language for all time. That should be given. And I really think that what we're missing in Jewish education is Jewish history. Jews don't know their own history. And when you don't know your own history, you are lacking significantly in the sense of your communal or collective identity. Those things are weak in the country right now, in the Jewish community. And if we're going to have a strong future, those are some of the central things that I think are important to strengthen.
And can you imagine any point at which you as a leader, a religious leader, would turn around to your community and the wider Jewish community and say, what's your plan B? Have you got it ready? Maybe you should.
It's an interesting thing. I'm not saying that in an outright way now. I do hear a lot of people, I'm doing it perhaps in terms of action. I hear a lot of people interestingly say to me, we're following you. Or, it's either Miami or Israel, they tell me. But I'm not, I don't rule that out. I mean, I think as a responsible leader, in the Jewish world, we need to do that, and there are various ways that we can and should do that. There's a Talmudic tradition, which I'll just say in English. It says, just as much as it's a mitzvah, it's a good thing to say something that can be heard by the audience. There's a mitzvah not to say something that cannot be heard by the audience, right? That they can't absorb, right? So that means basically you need to not just say things, but say things in a way that the people can absorb. So that's always, something that I have as a guiding principle. But yeah, I mean, these are strange, difficult, challenging times, and we need to adjust accordingly.
And as you come towards your end of the time in the UK, as you leave, are you leaving it a better place than when you arrived?
Well, I will say, I mean, there'll probably difference of opinion on this. My approval ratings have gone up and down over the years. But I do think that overall, my community, I am leaving in a better place, in a stronger place. They are, you know, they are at a place where they can grow and become stronger. I think so. I think that the community at large, the Jewish community at large, has done great things over the last decade. They've done a lot. They've accomplished a lot. I think that the current events are creating an irregular pressure that, you know, we were doing things kind of in a regular way, like general growth, you know, and the pressures of October 7th and the current world order requires the mustering of a lot more energy than we otherwise are kind of used to putting. So I think it is in a better place, but it won't stay in a better place if we don't step up to kind of the challenge that's coming at that.
Well, thank you so much for spending the time talking about all this. And we've got a few more months of you here, but I wish you all the best with the next chapter.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, pleasure.